everybody. In this teaching, I'm going to go over some popular interventions for PTSD and trauma treatment. So I've provided you a PowerPoint that's uploaded to Blackboard, and that goes in greater detail about the different interventions, and it's not an exhaustive list because there are many different ones out there and new ones coming up all the time. However, I am going to highlight tonight some of the important ones that I want you guys very familiar with, and also tell you about the different types, really categories of interventions. So let's start with that. So instead of going specifically into techniques right now, I want to talk in general about what the interventions are and what they try to do. So the first one is psychotherapy. This is what we know as our common talk therapy, and it includes support, empathy, rapport, and a specific person-centered approach. So this can be very helpful in PTSD treatment. We know that one of the most effective aspects of what we do is that therapeutic alliance. So talk therapy is very helpful in terms of a relational piece. It also has a focus on specifically using that front part of our brain, the prefrontal cortex, that can be offline during trauma. So it is important to combine traditional talk therapy with some other methods that we'll get into a little bit later. And that I'm putting those under the term creative approaches because they tend to access right brain and emotional brain and some other parts that are more engaged during a trauma. So traditional talk therapy is very effective, especially when we combine it with some other creative approaches. Exposure. Exposure interventions include exposing the client to their trauma memories. So instead of the typical avoidance of those painful memories where we try to do everything we can to avoid thinking of them, in an exposure therapy, we're actually going to intentionally have the client bring up some of those difficult memories, and we're going to do it in a safe, supportive setting to where we're helping them regulate their emotions and reduce their units of distress. So this is something that has been very common, and we're going to go into prolonged exposure therapy in a little bit, but that's the exposure part. So the goal is to have habituation, which is as they face those fears, then that fear response will decrease over a period of time, and especially within the context of a relaxed body and a safe setting. Cognitive approach. This is also known as top-down because it has to do with that prefrontal cortex and cognitions and working from that part of the brain, and then hopefully by changing the thoughts, we're changing the emotional response. So a standard intervention with cognitive would be replacing distorted thoughts such as shame and guilt and some magnification and overgeneralization and all those cognitive distortions that can come along with trauma exposure, and replacing it with something more functional. Somatic experiencing is another category of interventions. This has to do with body work. So we know from research over the last few decades, really, that trauma doesn't just affect our thoughts. It also affects our body, and there can be body memories of trauma. So we want to engage the body in our interventions as well. And so there are many different types of somatic experiences that we'll go over. And that's known as more of a bottom-up approach because we're starting more with the feeling, the sensations, and then going into changing the thoughts as a result of that. So memory reconciliation, and EMDR. So this is another category we're going to go over where we are actually pairing new memories and new meaning with the trauma memories. So things that are thoughts that are stuck in the present as if the trauma is currently happening. The goal is to reprocess those memories and help them go into long-term memory so that it's something that happened in the past. Psychopharmacology, so this is medications. There is no medical cure per se for trauma. However, there are many medications that can help reduce symptoms, so that obviously reduces the client's distress, but also helps them to move through the different phases of the triphasic model in terms of treatment. So if a client's symptoms are too high, they may not be able to work through some trauma memories. So sometimes medications can help those. There's varying views on medications, and your clients will come in with all different views. So it's important to talk with them and see what they need and what they're comfortable with. And then finally, another category of interventions is skill building. So these interventions focus on assertiveness training, anger management, interpersonal skills such as boundary work, coping mechanisms, and increasing internal and external resources, and other skill sets. So that's an overview of some categories of interventions. There is a list on your PowerPoint here of many ones that are included in your text. And at the end of the PowerPoint, I have a chart that we made for you so that you can look at the different ones, and it's just a nice summary. And those of you that know me know that I love summaries. But specifically, I want to go over a few a little more in depth tonight. So let's start with prolonged exposure therapy. So as I said, here the element is habituation. So the more that we expose somebody to the fear memory over time, that will decrease the conditioned emotional response. So this has been a standard in PTSD treatment for quite a long period of time. However, there is a risk of re-traumatization. So as clients are exposed to these horrific memories, there is the tendency to start reliving them. So it's very important that we help clients stay in present safety and monitor their SUDS levels, their standard units of distress, as they go through any exposure activity. I personally am not a fan of prolonged exposure, and I prefer some of the other methods we're going to talk about tonight, specifically for the due to the risk of re-traumatization. So although this is something that has been used in many different PTSD treatment settings, it is not something that I personally recommend. So let's move into more some cognitive behavioral approaches. So there's many different CBT approaches, including trauma focus, CBT, which you guys have learned about, exposure therapy, stress inoculation, cognitive processing, cognitive therapy, relaxation training, DBT, dialectic behavioral therapy, and acceptance and commitment therapy. That's just a list of some of them. So I want you familiar with these terms. So what is CBT in general? So it combines the cognitive, which is looking at the thoughts and recognizing which thoughts are not healthy and replacing those with healthier ones, as well as the behaviors. So changing some of the maladaptive behaviors into things that are more functional and productive. So we talked a bit about cognitive restructuring, and that's an important element across CBT. And there's also a theory that I want to highlight here, which is world assumptions theory by Janoff Bowman. And he said that trauma can change our schema or our belief sets. And our beliefs are influenced by our experiences. So trauma can change the way that we view ourselves in terms of being worthy of good things happening. Changes the way that we view the world as a good, safe place, and also the way that we see the world in terms of meaning and predictability. So that is an important theory to consider when we're using CBT interventions, to recognize how the traumatic experience may have caused some shifts in the way that our clients are thinking, and again, to recognize what is producing current distress and dysfunction for them, and how can we help modify those schema and those cognitive thoughts. So you guys have learned the TFCBT, so I'm not going to go into that in detail. I do want you to understand, though, that traditional TFCBT is with children and adolescents. So it's normally with children 3 to 18. And the important piece to recognize is that it's a collaborative model with both children and caregivers. So while some people use the term TFCBT to do cognitive behavioral work with adults just with a trauma lens, traditional TFCBT is with adolescents. Another intervention which I really like is cognitive processing therapy. So that's CPT. I know it's confusing with CBT and CPT. So it really combines cognitive theory and also some exposure therapy. So this is very effective in terms of being able to work with those unhealthy beliefs that are developed from the trauma. It involves psychoeducation, some exposure through written accounts, challenging distortions, and applying new meaning to trauma. So you guys can look at the slides for more detail on that. Another one that's very effective is DBT, which is dialectical behavior therapy. And I like this because it involves a group model, not a group psychotherapy model, but a group skill building model. So DBT is often used with people that not only have PTSD, but also some personality disorders, or at least interpersonal difficulties. So the model combines regular CBT with a radical acceptance, and this is very helpful in terms of that unconditional positive regard and helping people that have significant trauma histories to really feel the support even as they have had such difficulty with the relationships, but providing that safety net of supportive care. So instead of jumping right into some trauma memory work, DBT is very effective, especially for phase 1 in terms of working on emotional stabilization, grounding techniques, and skill building. So there are different elements that are both individual, such as individual therapy and telephone check-ins and that type of thing, as well as the group work for skill building and a consultation collaborative team. Okay, so let's shift gears now into EMDR. EMDR has become a wildly popular intervention and one that I absolutely love and use a ton in my clinical practice. So let me just tell you an overview about what it is. First and foremost, we don't know exactly why EMDR is so effective and how exactly it works. We have some theories, so there's different theoretical models that come up in terms of EMDR. So the goal here is to let any material that's attached to a trauma memory come into conscious thinking and be reprocessed. So some of the memories that get stuck in in that short-term memory part of the brain, and they flash. That's where we get our flashbacks and intrusive thoughts, because they haven't been processed correctly to go neatly into those long-term memory folders. So that's what EMDR does. It kind of brings those memories up that are connected with a trauma memory, and by bringing them up to conscious level, they are reprocessed. This happens through something we call dual awareness. So dual awareness means that the client is aware of that memory, so bringing it up to conscious, while also being aware of their current safety and the supportive, caring setting they're in, being grounded to the present reality. So this really drastically reduces the risk of being re-traumatized and kind of brought back into reliving that memory. Now, it doesn't eliminate the risk, so there is the potential for some reliving with EMDR also, and that's why it's very important, in my opinion, to have a thorough phase one, where you're really establishing that safety and emotional regulation before moving into phase two, which is where I feel EMDR should be, in that phase two model. And not everybody should have EMDR either. So that's where you do really proper assessment and screening. It's also something that you need additional training for. So you need to become certified in EMDR before using it. And it involves bilateral stimulation, so stimulating both parts of the brain at the same time. And that's done through eye movements, or beeps in the ears, or hand buzzers, or tapping on either side of the body. So anyway, it is a wonderful technique. It really can be very effective. I've used it with clients with OCD, panic attacks, anxiety, all sorts of things. But there is the potential for emotional flooding. It is an intense intervention. So people really need to be screened before they do it, and they need to be paced well throughout the EMDR, so that they are not overwhelmed and those intrusive thoughts do not increase instead of decrease. So the difference here, even though there's an element of exposure within EMDR, it is different than the prolonged exposure. It's part of something that we call memory reconsolidation. And this is a newer term, and interventions like EMDR, internal family systems, which we'll talk about in a bit, and coherence therapy are part of this type of memory consolidation, to where the clients are not just exposed to the memories, but there's also a mismatch experience, meaning that there's new meaning. So the memories are brought up, but then a new meaning is attached as they are reprocessed. So the client is able to see, this happened to me in the past, it does not affect my present or future, and there's a new cognitive network that's developed. So I don't want to go too in depth in this to overwhelm anyone, but I just want you aware of these terms so you know what's out there in terms of treatment models. Another part of EMDR is establishing safety in the beginning, and I've listed some examples of guided imagery exercises that can be done with EMDR, but also as other phase one exercises to help clients establish that internal safe place. I've also included an example of a butterfly hug, which is something that is great to do with children in terms of being able to do that bilateral stimulation by tapping on alternative shoulders and working on relaxation exercises. So I included some instructions for that. Okay, so now let's move into more bottom-up approaches, such as in terms of somatic experiencing. So we know that trauma can cause fragmentation, where there's this splitting off, this dysregulation that happens internally. So with body work, we want to do the opposite. We want to help clients re-regulate their systems, and this is true regardless of what approach we're using. We do want to have a re-regulation where the emotional response is appropriate. We're not responding to things that are not dangerous with a fear survival mode response, hypoarousal or hyperarousal. So there's this re-regulation. There's also a resensitization. So some people will experience a restriction in terms of their emotional response, some blunted affect, which is the restriction, and some flat affect, which means kind of going numb. And so it's that their senses had such an overload from the trauma that they've deadened in a way. So we want to reawaken those senses in terms of the sights and smells and sounds, and really re-engaging in life, because some clients will talk about the fact that They do not feel safe in their bodies. They do not feel like they're really living. They're just going through the motions. They feel very detached. So that's where we get this re-regulation and resensitization. I love this quote by Vanderkalt. Traumatized people chronically feel unsafe in their bodies. The past is alive in the form of a gnawing interior discomfort. Their bodies are constantly bombarded by visceral warning signs, and in an attempt to control these processes, they often become expert at ignoring their gut feelings and in numbing awareness of what is played out inside. They learn to hide from themselves. So that's what body work is all about, and I think that this should be part of every trauma therapy at some point in terms of really including the body and not just focusing on the mind, because there is obviously that connection between body and mind and spirit. And so for people that want that spiritual integration, being able to combine all three really helps us do more of a holistic approach. And so there's definitely different types of somatic therapies there, and I've listed some in your PowerPoint, and how some like the somatic experiencing work in terms of helping that activation system. So you guys can look at that. I've also included some mindfulness. I think nowadays everybody is at least aware to a degree of what mindfulness is, but including it within our trauma treatment helps with that emotional regulation. I've heard different speakers talk about that we need to be able to have our clients in a relaxed body in order to do the work, because if their body is in an activated survival mode, then their prefrontal cortex is offline anyway, so we're not going to get all that much done with regular talk therapy. So being able to integrate yoga or breathing exercises and different mindfulness activities, either in session or out of session, can definitely be helpful. Now, for some of our Christian clients, they may find that the term mindfulness is New Age or associated with Eastern religions, and may not be comfortable with yoga or mindfulness or something like that. So we need to be able to adjust it according to what they're comfortable with, and maybe just do some breathing exercises or progressive muscle relaxation or something like that. And I've included some examples of those on your slides. Okay, so you guys have gotten the video on dissociation, and so I included some slides on ego state therapy, which is working with the different parts or alters that are the split off parts of the personality when people are experiencing some dissociation. I've also included slides on internal family systems, which is a very popular approach right now in terms of working with DID and other forms of dissociation. So you guys can look at those. It basically involves trying to get some collaboration with the different parts and treat the person as a whole. Now, something that we call integration, which is getting rid of all the parts, doesn't always happen and is not the goal of treatment, and it can even cause some damage. So we really want to help the client understand that the parts have roles, and so even parts that seem bad or evil or harmful, they have been a part of the survival response due to the trauma. So they may be acting out in a way that seems harmful, but it might be that that's how they feel they need to protect the person from the danger or from sharing the secrets or something like that. So helping clients understand the functional roles of the parts can be very helpful, and then seeking to gain some collaboration and some integrative work there. So you guys can read more about that, and there's an exercise in there for you. Okay, so we have talked briefly about medications. I just want to highlight there's a few that are coming down the popularity scale here that such as ketamine and traditional SSRIs and antidepressants. But then there's also some alternatives such as ecstasy that are that there are some researchers that are like Vanderkult is one that are really trying to promote this as a means of working with PTSD, and some people claim great success from it, and obviously other people are concerned about using psychedelic interventions and that type of thing. So that is something that's happening in the field right now, just to be aware of, in addition to your traditional anti-anxiety, antidepressants, sleep medications, and that type of thing. So it's also interesting as marijuana is legalized in some states, seeing what role that will play in terms of people utilizing that as a alternative type of medication. Okay, so there's many other interventions. Neurofeedback is definitely something that is common right now. I've found mixed results. Some of my clients tried it and absolutely found significant improvement. Others did not. It is somewhat cost prohibitive as well, but it is something for you guys to be very aware of. In addition to some other approaches, art therapy is something I love to integrate with all trauma clients, regardless of whether I'm doing CBT, CPT, EMDR. Art therapy really accesses that right brain and that emotional part of the brain where trauma memories are stored. And so I love doing it, even though I'm not artistic. You do not need to be, and your clients do not need to be. In addition to that, music therapy, psychodrama, all of those creative interventions can really access that right brain. There's also animal therapy, amazing work done with horses and PTSD and other service animals. So that's something that you should be familiar with. In the future, I think we might see more virtual reality and other types of high-tech interventions that they're finding some success with PTSD. So that's something to be aware of. And also, so I included in the other interventions grief work. So regardless of the type of trauma, there's always an element of grief and loss, whether it's physical loss, loss of loved ones, loss of homes, or whether it's loss of the way that people saw the world or a feeling of safety. So in integrating grief work is something that we need to do with all of our clients and allow them to really process and express that grief. I found a great teaching by Joseph Prince. So if you look up his website, it's number 442 on grief work. Also scripture, Joel 2:25b. And then I included a TED Talk on trauma and lost time. And this is really, really important. So please, if you have time to watch this TED Talk, do that, because it will really help you explain to your clients and better understand when they come in and they're just talking about how, they're 40 years old and they didn't get to do so much of what they wanted, and their life would be so different if they didn't have this. So really being able to understand that and help them grieve that loss and work through the grief is super important as therapists. So check those out. And then, as I mentioned, there are charts at the end here as summaries for you guys for your textbooks and some of the interventions there. So there's numerous other interventions. I also love narrative therapy that works with some written accounts and doing some autobiographical work. So you guys can check those out, and hopefully this was a good snapshot overview to just talk you through some of the interventions, and you'll be using some of these in part 2 of your case study. So we will go over some of your questions in class, but for now, happy studying.